money to the elites that become client kings. And for some reason that's not at all clear, around this time, those debts were called in. It was said that they were no longer donations. And private citizens lent money as well. So Seneca, who was Nero's tutor, was lending money to Britons. And suddenly it was all called in. And that's the context that is given in Cassius Dio for the rise of Britain under Rome. So there are two different things, perhaps both happening at once, that we can account for here.
And so we've got to the point where Boudica mounts an uprising. Richard, can you take us through exactly what she did, what she managed to do, and how far her uprising got?
We know from Tacitus that she started off by approaching and destroying the colony at Camulodunum, or Colchester, in eastern England. This was the most high-profile, most important Roman city in Britain at the time. She then moves on, after sacking Colchester or Camulodunum, to sack the new Roman city at London, or Londinium. Now, London was a very significant trading port at this time, and the evidence we have from excavation indicates that it was a thriving, quite extensive settlement. After this, she moves further north, and she sacks and destroys another very high-profile Roman city at Verulamium, or St Albans, just north of London. And these three places, Camulodunum, Londinium and Verulamium, are the three most important Roman urban centres or cities in Britain at the time. She seems to be going deliberately for high status and politically and militarily important locations in her actions to defeat the Romans and drive them out of the province.
It is an amazing story, isn't it? It must have been astonishing for the Romans. And then it was a woman, military leader, who was sacking these towns. We mentioned earlier that the Roman historian Cassius Dio said the Romans felt shamed by the fact that a woman came so close to throwing them out of Britain. Do you think, Miranda, that this is why she became so famous or infamous, that the Romans were shocked by being defied by a woman warrior?
I think so. And it's interesting just to look sideways for a moment and look at other women who did the same thing and were equally regarded as absolutely beyond the pale. We need only think about Cleopatra, who managed to seduce both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and, again, tried to bring Rome to its knees. The idea that a woman could have this kind of influence on Rome at the highest level was regarded as absolutely appalling. And, one can't emphasise that too strongly. So the idea that a mere woman, not only a woman, but a Briton, an uncivilised barbarian. Some of the Greek writers, like Herodian, for example, thought the Britons had tails and waded in the mud and went naked and the whole of Britain was submerged in mud. I mean, these were people who thought Britannia was just, hardly worth thinking about.
And Jane, do you think the description of her that we had at the start of the programme, tall and red-haired and terrifying, do you think that probably was accurate?
I think it plays to what was already known about the appearance of Britons by Rome. And certainly the mention of her wearing a necklace or torque can be verified archaeologically. One of the best hoards of these very large necklaces we have actually comes from Iceni territory. It's called the Snetisham hoard, and it dates to about the 70s BC. So there are aspects of her appearance that would already have been well known, and of her jewellery as well would have been well known to people who had spent time in Britain.
And you said, Jane, that there were other rebellions against the Romans, perhaps less attention paid to them because they weren't led by women. But there were also other women warrior leaders among the British tribes, right?
Well, there was Cartimandua, who is in a different position because she was very pro-Roman. I think it is the gender of Boudica that keeps her rebellion in the Roman mind, the same as it was for Cleopatra and would be 2 centuries later for Zenobia in Syria. Women who stand up against Rome stand out, therefore their actions are recorded in more than one history.
Miranda?
One thing that I think we need to do is to put the whole women thing into a bit more context, because one of the interesting things about Britain is that in the Iron Age, the Middle Iron Age, for example, there is quite a lot of evidence for important independent females in terms of their burials. We have, for example, in Yorkshire, a number of so-called chariot or cart burials dating to the Middle Iron Age, I'm talking about 4th, 3rd century BC, where there are some female graves that are remarkably rich. And sometimes they are accompanied by male burials, sometimes they're on their own. So they're not just somebody's wife, they're on their own, and they are clearly important.
This is also the year that the Boudiccan rebellion breaks out is also the year that Suetonius Paulinus, the military governor, is waging a battle in Wales against the Druids, who have also risen against Rome.
But remind us who the Druids are, Jane.
Well, the Druids are the religious elite of Britain. So we've talked quite a lot about the aristocracy, but alongside them was a very powerful religious elite, kind of extra-tribal across the whole of Britain, who were responsible for divination and religious rituals and, according to the Romans, sacrifice and so on. And they're a good example of another kind of elite who, after some time under Rome, feels threatened for one reason or another, and they rise against the Romans. And clearly Suetonius has to go off to Mona or Anglesey in Wales and attempt to defeat them. This is also written about by Tacitus. And it's interesting that these two things are happening in the same year. It's very likely that Boudica realised that if she was going to make a stand, then in this year where the army was already distracted, it would be a good time to do it.
Now, I wonder to what extent, these places are spiritually really important in the late Iron Age. The Romans come in, they build Mediterranean-style cities, or they start setting about building Mediterranean-style cities at these locations. And is Boudica actually, to an extent, trying to put them back by burning these places down to the status they have in the late Iron Age, where they're the sort of places that we might expect people to be really feeling a strong connection with the spirits, and hence perhaps the Druids go deeper in the story, and Boudica's policy in the actions she takes are partly to actually follow up some of these spiritual connections, so that her war is actually a religious war as much as a sort of territorial, a political war.
Absolutely fascinating. So far we've heard about the Roman conquest and how Boudica was betrayed and rebelled, and a possible Druid connection. In part 2 of the forum, coming up in a few minutes, we'll look at the final battle that led to her defeat, and how in the last 500 years her image has evolved into a national icon, celebrating, among other things, female rule. But first, a news summary, so do stay with us.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, and here's what World Book Club have been reading.
In Hong Kong, a young Irish woman has a decision to make. Should Ava play it safe and stick with Julian? Or should she leap into the unknown with Edith?
We talked fast together. I was always slowing down in Hong Kong, either to help the kids understand me, or because Julian said everything at leisure and I felt I should stay in rank. Only with Edith could my mouth get ahead of me. The other mercy was that in the thick of assertion, I could pretend not to notice her knee against mine.
Nisha Dolan joins me to talk about exciting times.
I think Edith is, in this sense, the universe saying to Ava, OK, you say you don't like the following things about Julian. Here's someone of whom none of these things are true. Are you fully ready to choose this person instead?
World Book Club at bbcworldservice.com/World Book Club.
Still to come on the forum, more on the story of Boudica, Britain's most famous warrior queen. What is the story of the final confrontation between her troops and the Roman legions who finally defeated her? And what archaeological secrets still remain to be unearthed to reveal more about her tale? Still with me, Richard Hingley, Miranda Aldhouse-Green and Jane Webster. So stay with us. We'll all be back after the news summary.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. Security forces trying to restore order in Kazakhstan's main city Almaty say they've killed dozens of protesters who attempted to storm government buildings. Unrest, initially sparked by sharp rise in fuel prices, has spread across the country in recent days. Troops from a Russian-led military alliance have been deployed to quell the violence. A court hearing in Australia on whether the world number 1 men's tennis player Novak Djokovic should be deported has been adjourned until Monday. Lawyers for the Serbian star have challenged the decision to deny him entry. Border officials said Djokovic failed to provide adequate proof he was medically exempt from being vaccinated against COVID. North Korea says the test firing it carried out on Wednesday was of a hypersonic missile. State media said it was the second time Pyongyang had successfully launched such a weapon. A hospital chief in the Chinese city of Xi'an has been suspended after staff refused to treat a woman who was 8 months pregnant because her COVID test was out of date. She later miscarried. The incident has sparked public outrage. Several election rallies in India have been cancelled because of a surge of coronavirus infections. The main opposition party, Congress, said it was postponing all major events. The governing BJP also called off a rally but did not give a reason why. The Israeli military says soldiers have shot dead a Palestinian man in the occupied West Bank. A spokesperson said gunmen began shooting at troops who then returned fire. Regulators in France have imposed large fines on Facebook and Google over obstacles to letting users opt out of cookies that track their data. They've fined Facebook $67 million and Google nearly $170 million. And that's the BBC News.
This is the Forum from the BBC World Service, where we're talking about the story of Boudica, the English warrior queen. My guests are Professor Richard Hingley, Professor Miranda Oldhouse-Green and Dr. Jane Webster. So far we've looked at how the Roman occupation of Britain in the 1st century AD and how Roman brutality and possibly errors may have led to Boudica's rebellion, as well as other factors. But let's look a bit more closely at her as a warrior leader and the final battle which led to her demise. Richard, how close do you think she really was to kicking the Romans out of Britain? How much of a shock did they get?
The classical writers suggest that she came very close to doing it, but we've talked already about how reliable those might be. I think when we come to thinking about the aftermath of the rebellion, we're now getting some evidence of the scale of the Roman military response to re-establish the province. And I think we have to be aware of how much of a really dramatic political defeat it would have been if the Romans had accepted being driven out of Britain. I tend to think that she certainly gave them a very deep shock, and she certainly killed a lot of people, but the chances are that the Romans were always going to come back and punish the people who'd rebelled against them.
But Miranda, the Roman governor, staged a tactical retreat, didn't he, when she advanced on London and St Albans? He decided not to defend those Roman cities.
That's right. I mean, London was a prime example. He said anybody who can come with the legions we'll save, but everybody, the old, the disabled, the children, we have to leave. And, that was a really big decision for him to make.
Well, after the fall of London and what was to become St Albans, the Roman governor did decide to rally his forces in order to confront Boudica. And let's hear another passage from the Roman historian Tacitus, a description of the speech she gave in the run-up to that final battle.
Boudica drove round all the tribes in a chariot, with her daughters in front of her. "We British are used to woman commanders in war," she cried. "I am descended from mighty men. But now I am not fighting for my kingdom and wealth. I am fighting as an ordinary person for my lost freedom, my bruised body and my outraged daughters. The gods will grant the vengeance we deserve."
It's a terrific speech, isn't it? Inspirational. Though, Jane, we have to remember this is coming to us through Tacitus, who's a marvellous writer. But it does sound as though she was an inspirational leader.
Well, that speech is, of course, made up by Tacitus. And one of the things he's trying to do in the speech is to dig at the then Emperor Nero. As the speech goes on, and some of the things she says, the aim of the speech is to suggest that she is actually more of a man than Nero is. So we have to take these speeches with a considerable pinch of salt, I think.
It's always the case with political speeches, isn't it? Think of the domestic audience. But Richard, when it came to that final battle, the story is that her British tribes were, in the end, though there were many more of them, they were no match for the better trained and skilled and well-armed Roman troops. Where do we think this battle was held?
We have very little evidence to locate the battle. If we could locate Boudicca's final battle site, it would certainly help us a lot to think about the policies and strategies followed by both the Britons and the Romans. But at the moment, that's just something that we could wish for, and perhaps one day it will happen.
Let's come on to what happened to Boudicca herself. So her army's been routed, her undisciplined, ill-equipped army against the Roman legions finds that it's not a match for them when they have to confront them. What happens to Boudicca, Richard? What do we know? What do we think happened?
We're told two different things. We're told by Tacitus that she took poison, and we're told by Cassius Dio that she was killed and had a lavish burial. One of the things is that we really don't know what happened to her, and we wouldn't expect her to have a lavish burial if her burial was undertaken by her own people, because unlike quite a lot of the rest of southeastern Britain, we don't have a strong tradition of high-status late Iron Age burials in the territory of the Iceni. So if she came from the Iceni and she was the leader of the Iceni, we would really think that Cassius Dio was wrong and she wasn't buried in state, effectively. But whether she was killed in a battle or, as Tacitus tells us, took poison, we are confident she didn't survive the battle, at least.
And the thing is about the lavish burial, the Romans wouldn't have allowed that because it could be a place of pilgrimage.
Still to be located. But the point is that after she died and after the rebellion ended, she did seem to be somewhat effaced from history, except in popular culture, in by-the-way references. But it wasn't until the accounts by Tacitus and Cassius Dio came along that something was formulated, which is a description of what happened. But it wasn't until much later, that in the Renaissance, that she came back as a figure who people took account of. Let's leap forward to a point when she has political resonance again in a very obvious way, which is during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Miranda.
Well, of course, Elizabeth is a queen in a man's world, a very important, powerful woman, and perhaps what's also quite interesting is that she also has bright red hair. So there is this link, and we're talking about a period of time when people were beginning to get interested in a remote past for Britain, to give Britain a pedigree and a long antiquity. So this is at a time when classical writers are being rediscovered for the first time.
We're talking about the 16th century.
We're talking about the 16th century. So Boudicca is basically resurrected.
People are beginning to read Tacitus.
They are. They're beginning to read Caesar, they're beginning to read Tacitus and other classical writers. And so, but marching alongside a renewed interest in people like Boudicca is a renewed interest in the Druids. And they march side by side.
Probably no accident in that context that one of the many places that Boudicca is suggested to be buried is at Stonehenge.
Let's hear part of a poem by the Victorian British poet Francis Barker, written in 1859, entitled Boadicea. This is Boudicca making an impassioned speech to the assembled tribesmen.
Men, Britons, fathers, I appeal to you for yourselves, your wives, your children, and for the honour of our common country. I call upon you all to arouse yourself and struggle for freedom to the death. Soon, soon then will you enjoy the palm of victory, and your children and your children's children will bless you as they boast themselves the offspring of the free.
There you are, the offspring of the free, the rebel. It's very florid, isn't it? Nationalistic, speechifying. Richard, I suppose it would have appealed to Victorian England at the height of its imperial powers.
Yes, Boudicca's reinvented effectively as a figurehead of imperialism in the Victorian period. And I should say that there are people who are quite critical of Boudicca at the same time. So we can't assume that her interpretation, her reception is simple at any stage since the Renaissance. But
critical of her as someone who was herself ruthless.
Well, somebody who's barbaric. We have these two sides of Boudica which are always in opposition to each other. So Victorian imperialists didn't tend to like the idea of armed conflict with people, particularly uprisings and rebellions, because there were rebellions occurring against the British. And Boudica in that way is quite problematic to the British, but the dominant interpretation really throughout the 19th century is a very positive one of Boudica, that she is a British rebel. And being British, she is better than other rebels who might be rebelling against the British, because the British very much convince themselves that they're offering these opportunities to people in other parts of the world, and they've got an ethical superiority against the dictatorial militaristic Romans. Now, we think very differently today. Obviously, we think very critically of these nationalistic and imperialistic images of Boudica. They were part of what I call imperial discourse.
So was she a freedom fighter or a terrorist? That's another bit.
Yes. I mean, she could be both.
Miranda, you talked about the way her image is two sides of the coin, but there's another way in which it's two sides of the coin, isn't it? Is she an icon of victimhood, a wronged mother seeking revenge for herself and her daughters? Or is she the prototype of the empowered woman, the early feminist, capable herself of being brutal and cruel if she needs to? Because she was a role model for the suffragettes who were campaigning for votes for women at a certain point too, wasn't she?
Yes, absolutely. I don't like the victimhood idea. I think she overcame that and is much more three-dimensional or colourful as an early feminist who was not only taking on the might of Rome, but taking on the kind of male role of being an army commander able to rally large numbers of rather disparate Britons behind her. So I think that's the way that she would like to be remembered and the way that I think she should be remembered.
And I suppose we should also make the point that the image of Boudica is, if anything, even more resonant in contemporary popular culture. Certainly in this country, I'd say more people are familiar with the name of Boudica than used to be in my memory as a child. Jane, this is about the increase of attention being paid these days to women leaders throughout history, surely, isn't it?
I think that's true. There has been a strong surge of interest through the classical sources and through later historiography in rebellious women and in women who have taken on leadership roles. I mean, Boudica, for all she led a raggle-taggle army, destroyed a vexillation. That's 1,000 troops from a Roman legion. That's pretty significant.
And Miranda, I guess the other way in which she resonates with us is throughout the world, rebellions by underdogs. This is also a way in which she seems a contemporary figure.
Yes, I mean, that Britain itself was an underdog, and she herself as a woman was an underdog, and she was on the periphery, she was on the outer rim. So in every way she was beyond civilization, beyond the pale. And the Romans didn't see her coming. And it was a shock and it was a horror and it turned the Roman Empire upside down. And I really don't think we can overemphasise how Nero really thought about whether Britain was worth the candle. And he could easily have decided to leave it alone.
I said at the start of the programme that there have been women warrior leaders in many countries and many popular histories. I just wondered, the three of you, which are the female leaders in different parts of the world, warriors, who you would remember and single out. Jane, you mentioned Queen Zenobia, didn't you?
Yes, I think as a classical example, Zenobia is a fine case of a woman who today is a national hero in Syria. But I think as a more modern example.
So let's just remind people who she was. This is Queen Zenobia of 3rd century, in what is now modern day Syria.
Modern day Syria, yeah.
The Palmyran Empire.
Yeah, she led a rebellion against Rome.
But you said there's a more modern example.
Yeah, my modern example, actually, I was thinking about who I would see as a modern-day Boudica, and I would pick Jaya Ben Desai, who was born in Gujarat, grew up in Tanzania and then came to England and led in London the Grunwick factory strike in the 1970s. And that was a fight against a different kind of authority and a fight to establish workers' rights. But she's there for me in that same place as Boudicca.
What about you, Miranda? Have you given this any thought?
I think Cleopatra for me in the ancient world. And I would choose any one of the suffragettes, Emily Davidson perhaps, as my more modern example of somebody who really, really kicked over the traces and had the guts and the courage just to overturn the status quo.
Richard, what about you?
Well, I go back to the suffragists again, and Cicely Hamilton created a pageant in 1910 called A Pageant of Great Women. And basically this was an attempt to answer certain male views of what women were trying to do at this stage to get the vote. And Cicely Hamilton actually put together a range of great women from the past, and some of them are British or European. One of the women she quotes is the Rani of Jhansi. Now, the Rani of Jhansi was an Indian leader, a female leader, who was very deeply involved in the Indian uprising, or as the British called it, the Indian Mutiny. And she led resistance for some time against the Britons and was killed in 1858. And I find it really interesting in 1910 that Cicely Hamilton and the people who were helping her to create this pageant actually took the Rani of Jhansi largely as a positive figure, not a critical figure. We're still in 1910 in a period in which the British Empire is a very dominant world force. And I think, it's interesting to me that Cicely Hamilton, perhaps I'm quoting two powerful women here, is actually taking the side of the Rani of Jhansi and creating her as a very positive figure alongside Boudicca.
I guess if you look even further afield around the world, it doesn't take very long in many places to find either warrior queens or strong leaders who are women, who are still remembered by their cultures. There's Yananga, the warrior daughter of the 12th century king in what is now modern-day Ghana. There's Princess Pingyang at the end of the Sui dynasty in China, who raised an army known as the Army of the Lady. There's Queen Olga of Kiev, who lived in 10th century Kiev and both obliterated her husband's enemies and converted her people to Christianity. And in modern-day Arizona, there's the 19th century Apache warrior and prophetess Lozan. So what this seems to say to us, Miranda, is that there have always been these women warrior leaders or queens. And we remember them because at the same time that they've always been there, we do, in many parts of the world, they are seen as a little bit extraordinary.
They are, and the interesting thing, and the further back in time you go, the more interesting it is, that these women's names are remembered. There are countless male warriors and leaders whose names have passed into oblivion, whereas the women are remembered, their names are remembered, and so they come down to us as very rounded people who are as alive today in memory as they were when they were striding around with their spears cutting off people's heads.
Well, certainly Boudicca, as the result of this programme, feels very alive, even though, as we've said, there are a paucity of resources, either written or archaeological. So we have to give credit to those Roman historians, too, for painting a picture of her, an image that's still with us today. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Many thanks to you all. This has been a wonderful programme, so interesting. Professors Richard Hingley and Miranda Aldhouse-Green and Dr. Jane Webster. Do listen to our other programmes. You can find them all on our website or as podcasts. But for now, from me, Bridget Kendall, and all of us on the Forum team, goodbye.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. And now, Sporting Witness, with me, Viv Jones. Today we head to Afghanistan, to the remote, rugged mountains of Bamiyan province. In 2011, these soaring peaks became the backdrop of something unlikely and uplifting in this struggling war-torn country. Because Bamiyan is where Afghan skiing was born.
A lot of people go skiing here.
Yeah.
Who goes skiing? Afghans?
Afghanistan internationals.
Really?
Yeah.
When the BBC's Lise Doucette visited Bamiyan in 2011, She was thrilled to see Afghans having fun on the slopes.
These Afghan boys tagged along with us, taking to the slopes with whatever they can find at home.
Look at that. A bit of wood, a rubber boot, a bit of metal.
The littlest is sliding down the slopes in his mother's shoes.
One of the first Afghans to embrace skiing was Alisher Farhang. He became one of Afghanistan's top skiers, a Winter Olympic hopeful. He grew up in a small village nestled in the Koi Baba range.
It's a kind of rural area. So my father is the farmer, and my 5, 6, 7 generation, they were all farming in the village. Like taking the ships on the mountain.
Before skiing started in Bamiyan, in the winters people tended to avoid the mountains because of the danger of avalanches and wolves. So Alisher was amazed when, on a cold, sunny day in February 2011, he first caught sight of a figure silhouetted against the snow, hurtling down the slope towards him.
Going fast, so fast on the mountain. It was something not only for me, but for the entire people of the village. It was something magic they were doing on the snow.
He would soon discover that the magic he'd witnessed was called skiing, and that a new travel agency, supported by a development charity, had started offering ski holidays to tourists seeking a unique adventure. Bamiyan was relatively safe for foreigners back then, and its mountains have perfect snow.
So it took a couple of days for me to get closer to the skier and ask them finally what it is. I said I am really interested to learn this. I was really excited to try skiing.
An Italian ski guide employed by the agency agreed to give Alisher his first lesson.
It wasn't a nice experience. Even walking with those boots were not so easy. Of course, we didn't have a proper skiing clothes. And it wasn't waterproof, so all the clothes were wet, and afterwards it got freezing cold. You just felt so strange with your legs. And especially when the skis go under the snow and you struggle to take it back. I already got the signal that it's going to be a tough sport.
So after that first day, you've fallen over, you're wet, you're freezing cold, your boots don't fit. You thought, I'll try this again?
Slowly, it got better. As soon as, I could go a little bit fast and make a turn, then it felt like, this is something nice.
Alisher was soon hired as Afghanistan's first professional ski guide. There wasn't a ski lift, so his first job was to lug heavy equipment up the slopes.
I was quite good on going uphill and carrying a lot of weight.
Yeah, I guess being a shepherd going up the mountain all the time, it makes you very fit.
Yeah.
The job was fun, and he loved meeting skiers from all over the world. But some of his neighbours in the village were suspicious of Westerners.
Because of the lack of information, people consider the foreigner all as infidel.
As infidels?
Yeah, they were talking to my father that your son start working with the infidel. So he will be converted to another religion. And he is working with dirty people. A couple of times, actually, they didn't let me to go skiing because they said, oh, you're destroying the snow will get melt soon. We will not have enough water in the future because you destroy all the snow with the infidels. They are dirty, they will make the snow dirty, and the snow will be gone. We will not have any water. Sometimes they felt jealous with me that I'm working with foreigner and making money. But most of the time it was just because of this religious issue.
Alisher didn't give up. He was hooked on his sport. He wasn't alone. More and more local young people and kids wanted to try skiing. A small ski school was set up with international support, and Alisher became an instructor. Things really took off with the start of the Afghan Ski Challenge, an annual race with skiers from all over the world competing against homegrown talent. The challenge attracted crowds from all the local villages. Even some of Alisher's more hostile neighbours were won round by it. Skiing is an expensive sport, but some resourceful local people had the idea of making their own skis.
It got quite popular. I just realised that there were so many people interested. They couldn't compete with the people who had a proper ski gear. So I say, well, let's give them opportunity to come and participate to a race.
That's how the Afghan Ski Challenge added the wooden ski race. Alishar says it drew bigger crowds than the main race. No one could resist the slapstick comedy of kids crashing into each other, tumbling in the snow on their homemade skis.
For me, the biggest part is to see people enjoying. Doesn't matter how difficult the life was, still they were happy. We really wanted to achieve peace through sport. Sport doesn't allow people to talk about the religion, the language. Sport talks about having fun.
What does it feel like when you're out there skiing?
This young boy told Lise Doucet, "When I ski, I feel just like a bird. I feel very happy, and I sing sweet songs."
May this country give him the peace and prosperity, just enough to make him a ski champion someday.
In 2017, the Bamiyan Ski Club got sponsorship to pay for 2 top Afghan skiers to receive professional coaching in Switzerland. Alishar was selected, alongside his friend Sajjad Husseini. Their aim was to become the first Afghans ever to compete at the Winter Olympics. They didn't quite manage to qualify for the 2018 Games, but they had the 2022 Games in their sights. Then their funding ran out. And then the pandemic hit. And then the Taliban took over.
Me and Sajjad, we were trying to go to the Olympic and represent Afghanistan in a positive way. Of course, we couldn't compete for a gold medal or a silver medal. No, we could be the last people to ski on the Olympic slopes, but we had hope on ourselves and in the country. But now it's just a nightmare and everything went back to zero.
Alishar remembers life under the old Taliban regime, when sports were banned and associating with foreigners could get you killed. Skiing put him in danger, but the skiing community may have saved his life. Some Italian friends managed to get Alishar and his wife and 2 small kids on a flight out of Kabul. Sajjad was also rescued, along with a women's ski champion, 17-year-old Nazima Haizad. Alishar's family have settled in Italy's Trento province.
It's a beautiful province with a nice mountain. For me, living in the mountain is something very, very special.
And do you hope that one day you will be able to go back?
Oh, sure, it's always a dream. Yeah, hopefully. Like this hope keeps human alive. You can't live without hope.
Alishar Fahang was speaking to me, Viv Jones, for Sporting Witness.
This is the BBC World Service, where Wafa Mustafa is telling the story of her father's disappearance.
It was the 2nd of July 2013. The neighbor sees my mom, and then she says, a group of armed men attacked your place. We believe that he was taken by the Syrian regime. In many cases, they tell the family that we did not detain this person.
Gone, but not forgotten. At bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. You're listening to the BBC World Service.
Our technology reporter Zoe Kleiman told us more.
I asked our Washington correspondent Chris Buckler what was in this article.
BBC Mundo's Guillermo Moreno joined one of the queues.
Let's speak to our China media analyst Kerry Allen from BBC Monitoring.
This is the BBC World Service on ABC News Radio.
BBC News, I'm Clive Hunson. Court proceedings over Novak Djokovic and his cancelled visa have been adjourned until Monday morning. The judge asked both parties to give him their submissions at the weekend. The tennis player's visa was cancelled when he arrived in Melbourne overnight in a dispute over whether he has a medical exemption from COVID vaccination. More from reporter Nicole Asher in Melbourne.
Djokovic's lawyers are arguing that his visa cancellation is unjust and unreasonable, but he will stay in detention for now, ahead of another hearing on Monday. Now, his legal team don't want him deported before the Federal Circuit Court judge comes to a decision, and they want that decision made before Tuesday, when they say the Australian Open needs to know whether or not he'll be playing. Judge Kelly wasn't particularly impressed by that request, saying that the tail won't wag the dog. In the meantime, Djokovic and his legal team commence the waiting game ahead of the next hearing on Monday.
And Border Force officials are investigating another player and an official granted medical exemptions by Tennis Australia. Government sources have told the ABC that travel documents provided by the pair are now being examined to see if they too meet Australian entry requirements. Australia and Japan have signed a landmark defence agreement for closer cooperation between their militaries. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida met in a virtual summit this afternoon. It follows a year of talks between the two governments, and Mr Morrison says the treaty will form an important part of both countries' response to uncertainty.
It will underpin greater and more complex engagement, interoperability and cooperation between the Australian Defence Force and the Japanese Self-Defence Forces. We know our relationship is much more and much deeper than just about security issues.
The Northern Territory government says it won't adopt a change to testing rules determined at the recent National Cabinet meeting. Chief Minister Michael Gunner says Territorians who returned positive rapid antigen tests are still required to get a follow-up PCR one, because the local health system can handle it.
Down south, the PCR testing system is broken. In the Northern Territory, over 70% of PCRs are back in under 24 hours. A positive PCR keeps us confident in our caseload and control of our case numbers.
Elsewhere, the New South Wales opposition leader Chris Minns says positive rapid test results should be reported to health authorities to ensure outbreaks are properly monitored.
Now, we expect rising case numbers right across New South Wales, but New South Wales Health will still need to deploy nurses, doctors and frontline technicians to areas that have the highest number of cases.
Western Australia has recorded just one new local case of COVID-19. The case is in quarantine and is not related to WA's ongoing Delta cluster. Authorities continue to investigate how 2 hotel quarantine security guards who've tested positive to COVID caught the virus. The brother of notorious gang leader Bassem Hamzy has been shot dead in Sydney's west. Ghassan Amoum was shot multiple times in South Wentworthville this afternoon. Acting Superintendent Glenn Fitzgerald says clearly it was a targeted shooting.
Any type of incident like this is a worry. This is what happens when firearms are in possession of the wrong people. So all I can do is give the undertaking that there is a significant investigation. There has been for some time, and there will be police on the streets door knocking a lot of premises as this goes on.
To the cricket, and Australia is in a commanding position in the 4th Ashes Test against England at the SCG. ABC Sports' Jim Maxwell has more.
Usman Khawaja's 9th Test century, his first for 3 years, guided Australia to a powerful 8 declared for 416. Khawaja made 137, sharing a century partnership with Steve Smith, who made 67, one of 5 wickets to Stuart Broad. A side strain took Stokes out of the attack as England battled for wickets against the lower order. Stark making 34 and Lyon a cameo 16 not out. England wobbled to 13 without loss. Crawley being reprieved by a Stark no ball after he was caught at slip. So into day 3, it's Australia 8 for 416 versus England none for 13. Jim Maxwell, ABC Sport.
And the Women's Ashes Cricket Series will start a week earlier on January 20th to allow Australian and England teams to complete a 10-day quarantine in New Zealand before the World Cup in March. The series will start with the first of 3 T20 internationals at the Adelaide Oval. ABC News. Friday's weather in the capital cities. Brisbane expecting a showery day tomorrow, 27 degrees at the top. Sydney 23 degrees overnight, then a shower or two tomorrow, 28 degrees expected. In Canberra it's 19 at the moment, 17 in the early hours. Showers and storms, some of them heavy tomorrow, getting up to 25 degrees. Melbourne, it's 26 at the moment, 21 in the early hours. Tomorrow will be humid with a possible storm, getting up to 29. Hobart, it's 16 at the moment, 25 tomorrow, rain and a possible storm. A shower or two expected for Adelaide, getting up to 23 tomorrow after 16 in the early hours. Perth 29 right now, 38 tomorrow and sunny, and Darwin expecting a possible late shower, 34.
It's 11:06 GMT. You're listening to the newsroom on the BBC World Service with me, Valerie Sanderson. Until now, Kazakhstan had been one of the most stable countries in Central Asia. Most protests are banned, and with little opposition, the hardline government has attracted billions of dollars in foreign investment. But this cast-iron reputation has been severely damaged after protests in which dozens of people have been killed. Now the government has called in Russian troops. Well, that's the sound of a plane taking off from a military airbase just outside Moscow. The Russians on board have been described as a peacekeeping force. Police said that security forces had, to use their words, eliminated rioters in Kazakhstan's biggest city, Almaty. Soldiers have also been killed, and on the streets of Almaty this morning, the army opened fire again. Well, the footage only shows troops firing their weapons, while the Kazakh president has blamed foreign-trained terrorist gangs for the violence. Our Central Asia correspondent, Rehan Dimitri, is monitoring developments from Tbilisi in Georgia and joins us on the newsroom now. Rehan, the police say some demonstrators who tried to storm government buildings have been killed. What do we know about casualties?
There was a statement made by the spokesperson from the Almaty police department, and he said dozens of attackers or extremists, as he described them, have been killed. That was in the early hours on Thursday. Now, we don't know the exact number, but also judging by some of the footage that has emerged on social media, and this is unverified, it's impossible to verify any information at the moment because all the internet is down and all the phones are down in Kazakhstan. But that footage showed a number of bodies inside the morgue. So unfortunately, also officially, we have the number of 13 policemen that were killed in the Almaty riots and over 300 injured policemen and National Guard officers. But that could also suggest that the number of civilians could be quite high, number of civilians that were killed in these riots.
And what do we know about the Russian troops being sent to Kazakhstan?
Well, the Russian troops are already on the ground. We don't know the exact number, how many Russian troops have been sent to Kazakhstan, but they're there under the CSTO. It's the Russia-led military bloc, which comprises, apart from Russia, of 5 former Soviet countries. And a statement from the CSTO said that their main mission will be to protect important state and military facilities and also assist Kazakhstan law enforcement in stabilizing the situation. Now, the presence of the Russian troops will be of great concern to many in Kazakhstan because there's always this kind of ever-present fear of Kazakhstan's northern neighbor, not least because about 20% of Kazakhstan's population are ethnic Russians. And many, of course, will be worried that it could be a threat to Kazakhstan's sovereignty.
And who do you think is the real power in the country? The current president has been in power since 2019, but is he or his predecessor, Nursultan Nazarbayev, in control, do you think?
Well, up until recently, there were no questions about Nursultan Nazarbayev, who the country's first president, who officially stepped down back in 2019 and handpicked his successor, the current president. There were no doubts that the 81-year-old Mr. Nazarbayev had quite a lot of power in his hands. But there are unconfirmed reports, once again, that he may have left the country. I've seen one footage that came from Western Kazakhstan, from the city of Aktobe. Also, there were large gatherings, but people are dispersing there now. And they posted this clip in which a number of protesters are cheering and saying that their main objective has been met. And that main objective was the removal of Nursultan Nazarbayev from power, because that's one of the demands that people were demanding in the past few days.
Rehan.
And that.
Thank you very much indeed. That was Rehan Dimitri. The Novak Djokovic saga continues. First, the world number one in men's tennis was told he could not compete in the Australian Open without being fully vaccinated. Then he was allowed to travel with a medical exemption. Now the border authorities in the city of Melbourne have denied him entry and detained him. Together with Roger Federer and Rafa Nadal, Djokovic makes up what is often referred to as the big three in men's tennis. And now Spain's Nadal has expressed some sympathy for the world number one.
In some way, I feel sorry for him. But at the same time, he knew the conditions since a lot of months ago. So he makes his own decision.
The Australian Health Minister Greg Hunt defended the decision to deny entry to Djokovic.
There was an exemption that had been provided through the Victorian government process. Clearly that did not pass the standards of proof that were required by the Australian Border Force. Yes, it's tough, but it's fair and it's equitable and it's one rule for all under this Australian government.
But is it that clear-cut? Well, a court hearing will take place on Monday to determine whether or not Novak Djokovic can stay to compete or not. He's awaiting the decision in a quarantine hotel. Well, our correspondent Shama Khalil is outside that building and she told us the latest.
At the moment, we understand that the judge that has heard Novak Djokovic's legal team challenge has said that he needed more time for both sides of that case to submit their evidence, to submit their arguments over the weekend, and then the hearing will resume on Monday.
And what is happening at the hotel? Do you know? I mean, is he in a room with guards? What's happening?
It's unclear what is happening inside the hotel. We know that after hours of being questioned by the Australian Border Force at Melbourne Airport about his visa application, about the medical exemption, the authorities said that he did not meet the criteria, did not meet the rules, and that he was meant to be deported. He was then reportedly taken to that hotel half an hour away from the airport. No one knows exactly where he's staying. No one knows what the condition he's in inside that hotel. But we do know, I can tell you that I'm looking at a number of his supporters that have been gathering outside the hotel for hours now, and the numbers keep increasing. Many of them from the Serbian community. A lot of them are saying that they're frustrated, that they're angry, quite shocked at that decision. And many have asked, well, why bring him all the way over here to then turn him away on a technicality? And I think this goes to the heart of that story, of that controversy.
Is this really all about a clash between the government and the federal government in the state?
Yes, I think Novak Djokovic was going to land in the middle of a controversy anyway. But, you know, this has become much more chaotic and confusing as the hours went by. And definitely the world number one is now in the middle of a political tussle between the state government here in Victoria, who say he should be allowed to come in, should be allowed to compete. Remember, he is the biggest name. He has dominated the Australian Open. He brings in a big crowd. And the federal government, Scott Morrison's government, who are under increasing pressure at the way that they have handled the COVID-19 situation, especially with the Omicron wave. And they want to make the point that no one is above the rules, that there is no special treatment.
What about other players? Because others have come in on the same kind of exemption, haven't they?
That's another question that remains unanswered, and it's still quite unclear. Because remember, Tennis Australia, when there was initial anger at the exemption that Novak Djokovic has been given, have come out and said this is not special treatment, that of the 26 athletes that have applied for this exemption, a handful had actually been granted one. What are their circumstances? Why are they in Australia? And what's stopping Novak Djokovic from staying in the country? It really, again, remains quite unclear, and there isn't enough explanation from the authorities, from Tennis Australia. Everybody seems to want to make their own point, which is that Novak Djokovic should either come here because of the exemption, which is what the state government wants to make, or that Novak Djokovic should not be above the rules. And if the border authorities have made that decision, then that decision should be followed.
Scientists are preparing to unpack the giant mirror on the James Webb Space Telescope, which was launched into orbit on Christmas Day. It's a key component of the mission to see the first stars to shine in the universe, as our science correspondent Jonathan Amos explains.
The giant golden primary mirror is really the defining feature on the telescope. It's the largest astronomical reflector ever sent into space, and its great size will enable scientists to see the faintest objects from the farthest reaches of the cosmos. But like much else on James Webb, the mirror needs unpacking. It was sent up like a drop-leaf table with its sides tucked back. These now need to come out to allow the telescope to be properly focused, a task that will begin next month. So far, all deployments have gone very smoothly. With a properly set-up mirror, we can expect to see the first pictures from Webb by the middle of the year.
This is the newsroom. Jerry has the headlines this hour.
The police in Kazakhstan's main city, Almaty, say they've killed dozens of protesters who tried to storm police headquarters and other buildings overnight. An Australian court has adjourned until Monday a hearing to decide whether the world #1 tennis player Novak Djokovic should be deported. And North Korea says a test it carried out on Wednesday involved a hypersonic missile.
A year ago today, US democracy was under attack when supporters of Donald Trump, goaded by him in the dying days of his presidency, stormed the Capitol in Washington. For many people, the pictures of their fellow Americans invading and ransacking the building were a national embarrassment. But Mr. Trump remains hugely popular with a large number of Republicans who see him as a national hero. Our North America correspondent Ali Maqbool, who covered the events of 6th of January, has this report.
You'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong.
It was a last-ditch attempt to overturn an election result.
Take that house! Take it now!
Trump supporters marched from where he'd been giving a speech. When the chaos finally came to an end, it emerged one protester had been shot dead as she tried to enter the speaker's lobby. 4 others died, including a police officer. Nearly 140 of his security colleagues were injured, and 4 who responded to the attack took their own lives in the aftermath.
Donald J. Trump, President of the United States, is impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors.
But for all the condemnation around the world for the violence and Donald Trump's role in inciting it, when it came to impeaching him, the vast majority of Republican congressmen and women and senators sided with the former president.
The Senate judges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, former president of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the article of impeachment.
It was deeply disappointing to the handful of Republican politicians who'd voted to impeach Donald Trump over the events of that fateful day, like Congressman Peter Meijer.
I certainly thought that, there'd be a moment of reflection and when they saw how far that went and the dangers of giving aid and comfort to political violence, that would force a little bit of a reckoning and a course correction.
Not only was he wrong, it's in fact Republicans like him, critics of Donald Trump and his involvement in the storming of the Capitol, those who say the election result needs to be respected, that find themselves ostracised by the large Trump-supporting section of the party.
Part of their goal is to make it insufferable for anybody who doesn't go along, it doesn't march to the beat of that drum. I'm a very stubborn individual. I'm not the type that wants to give those folks a victory. So, they'll have to drag me out kicking and screaming there.
Well, it might be easier than that. In Michigan, where he's standing for re-election as a congressman later this year, Peter Meijer has already faced a backlash from local conservative groups who've called his criticism of Donald Trump a betrayal.
It's banana republic stuff when political prisoners are arrested and denied due process. That happens.
But for other Republicans, their support for Donald Trump, calling those arrested for their involvement in the storming of the Capitol political prisoners, and a continued refusal to accept the election result of late 2020 is the very platform on which they stand.
I'm not part of that political party, so I'll let those guys get the
Take Joe Kent of Washington State, who's standing for congressional office in November. He gave that speech at an event close to the Capitol a couple of months ago in support for those on trial for attacking Congress a year ago.
There's a civil war going on right now in the Republican Party for the direction of the Republican Party. I believe the America First, the President Trump movement, that we have the vast majority of the country and of the Republican Party, but I'm not going to underestimate the establishment for 1 minute.
Donald Trump has, perhaps unsurprisingly, endorsed Joe Kent's candidacy, and it's the seal of approval many Republicans are clamouring for. A recent poll found the majority of Republican voters said they believed there was enough fraud in the 2020 election to change its outcome.
It was a trial that made headlines around the world. Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty last week of 5 counts of grooming and trafficking underage girls for sex for Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted paedophile who died in prison in 2019. But now her lawyers have claimed that one of the 12 jury members made comments to the media which are grounds for a mistrial. Prosecutors say the man told reporters he had himself been a victim of sexual abuse, a fact that wasn't disclosed to the court beforehand. The BBC's Neda Tawfiq sent us this report from New York.
In 3 different press interviews, the juror, who asked to be identified by his first and middle names, Scotty David, revealed that he had been sexually abused as a child. Jurors were asked to disclose that information in a questionnaire ahead of their selection and to declare under penalty of perjury that their answers were true. Prosecutors highlighted that in his interviews, Scotty David said he flew through the survey and did not recall that specific question. But he added that he would have answered honestly. Now prosecutors want to hold an inquiry with a hearing on the matter in a month. Ghislaine Maxwell's attorney said the revelation presented incontrovertible grounds for a new trial. In the interviews, Scotty David said he'd helped other jurors understand things from a victim's point of view. Once he'd done so, another juror came forward with their own story. He added that his past experience didn't affect his ability to be an impartial juror.
The Tigray region in Ethiopia, which has been hard hit by the conflict in the country, is facing a fresh crisis in its hospitals. Doctors say patients are dying because of a shortage of medicines and equipment. Medical staff say the government is blocking aid from reaching the region, which is under the control of rebel Tigrayan forces, claims which the government in Addis Ababa have repeatedly denied. Catherine Birahanga has read the doctor's report from one hospital in the city of Mekelle.
At 3 months old, Surafiel Ma'arig weighs less than he did at birth. In a photograph shared with the BBC, he's lying on a pink blanket, his ribs visible through his thin, wrinkled skin. Medical staff at Ida Referral Hospital in Mekelle say they're running out of critical therapeutic foods for Surafiel and others. In a report, they detail cases of patients who suffered kidney failure, a blood bank that no longer operates, and cancer sufferers who died in pain. A doctor who contributed to the presentation told the BBC the facility will stop surgeries next week because of a shortage of supplies. The United Nations says the federal government is operating a de facto blockade of Tigray and has only allowed 12% of required aid convoys into the region since July. The government denies this and blames the suffering in Tigray on the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which controls the region.
And Jerry has some other news from our news desk.
Reports from northeastern Syria say there have been exchanges of fire between US-led coalition forces and Iranian-backed militias for the 3rd day in a row. Syrian activists say that unmanned drones have been used to carry out airstrikes on sites where the militias are believed to be based in the Deir ez-Zor region. Several election rallies in India have been cancelled amid a surge of coronavirus infections. The main opposition Congress party said it was postponing all major events in states due to hold polls until the COVID situation improves. And the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has announced that Beijing will appoint a special envoy to the Horn of Africa. Correspondents say it shows China intends to be more actively involved in the region. Mr. Wang is currently on a 3-nation tour of Africa.
The Hollywood actor Leonardo DiCaprio has had his name immortalised not only on the silver screen, but also now in a tropical forest in Cameroon. A tree that's new to science has been named after him. I asked our science correspondent Helen Briggs first about the new species of tree.
Well, it's been described as incredible, beautiful. It's quite a weird-looking thing, this small tropical evergreen tree. It's about 4 meters long and it's got strange, glossy yellow flowers that just grow from its trunk. So it looks very, very unusual. And it's a member of the Lang Lang family and found only in a small area of a critically endangered forest. And it's completely new to science. So for the first time, scientists have been able to look at its features and they've decided that it is completely new, so it should get a name of its own.
So it is very special.
It is very special, yes. Uvariopsis DiCaprio, and DiCaprio bit is named after the actor Leonardo DiCaprio because he helped to save the forest where it's found. So it's only found in one part of the world, in the Ebo Forest in Cameroon. And Dr. Martin Cheek from the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew explains why they've chosen its name.
We decided to name this wonderful new tree species after Leonardo DiCaprio as Uvariopsis DiCaprio because of the help Leonardo DiCaprio gave campaigning to overturn the decision to log the Ebo Forest.
So it's a real honour for the Hollywood actor.
It is, yes. And the reason is because he did some campaigning on this issue about opening the forest up to logging. So scientists have been working there for years with local people, with local botanists, and they were horrified when they heard of plans to allow vast swathes of the forest to be opened up for logging. So they wrote to the government pointing out all the precious animal and plant species there that could be at risk if the forest is cleared. And that issue was picked up by DiCaprio, who of course has millions of followers on his various social media platforms. So he put some posts out and added momentum to the campaign, and the government later revoked plans to allow logging, and the scientists credit DiCaprio with helping them to get this issue publicised and to get this attention.
And finally, a film student from England who became a phenomenon on the video sharing app TikTok has been crowned the BBC's Sound of 2022. Pink Pantheress, who's 20, was named this year's most promising up-and-coming musician by a panel of 130 industry experts, among them Elton John, Billie Eilish and Ed Sheeran. Our music correspondent Mark Savage has been speaking to her.
I found the street of the house in which she stayed.
There's an air of mystery surrounding Pink Pantheress. When she first started uploading songs to TikTok last year, she kept her face obscured. And even today, she refuses to reveal her real name.
I personally find it easier to kind of not lay every single card you have on the table. I like my privacy.
Her music, a fusion of pop melodies and clattering breakbeats, speaks for itself. Within months of her TikTok debut, she'd scored 2 top 40 hits in the UK. And now she's been chosen as the BBC's Sound of 2022, placing her alongside former winners like Adele, Years and Years and Celeste.
When you wipe your tears, do you wipe them just for me? Do you wipe them just for me?
And finally, this hour, Russian-led troops have arrived in Kazakhstan, where days of violent anti-government protests have left dozens of people dead. That is the headline this hour. You have been listening to The Newsroom from the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service, celebrating the Black speculative arts movement.
Hello, I'm Cherie Renee Thomas. The last couple of decades have sparked a growing wave of enthusiasm for literature, art, comics, music, film, and video games by Black artists around the world.
We have been nerdy since nerds have existed, and we're in this cultural moment where Black nerddom is being universally recognized.
As a literary device, it centers Black cultures and reimagines how society might be different if viewed not from the margins, but from another lens.
This movement has grown into an international phenomenon. So many artists that were relatively unknown really have become international brands.
I'm going to be speaking with some of the wonderful creators, curators, and scholars and find out how, after all this time, it is finally being recognized for the bold, innovative, blockbuster, creative movement that it is.
Black speculative arts at bbcworldservice.com.